Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third edition of the Levers of Power, the Levers of Control. And today we're asking and answering one simple question, which is why education sucks. Right? Why is education so bad? Why is it so rubbish in our society? And I'm going to be going through why education just doesn't work in the majority of countries, especially Western countries. We're going to be going into the historical significance of education, how it started, and we're going to be talking about that for the next hour or so. So come with me, let's have a look at this, and let's get into it. So let's say that you were put in charge of creating a brand new education system, right? That you were not only a guy in it, that you were the guy, the education guy. So where would you start? Well, the first thing to think about is these little children, no matter what age they are, whether they're like 6 or 10 or 15, they're going to become adults. And when they become adults, they're going to need to work. They're going to need to contribute to society in some way, shape or form. So what kind of attributes would you like in a functioning society, in a functioning adult? Well, the first thing that you need is that you need them to be able to interact with the world in some way. You're going to need them to deliver to you data and information, and for them to be able to receive data and information. Another word for this is, of course, literacy, which basically includes reading, writing, and effectively all this is communication. Right? That's all this is, right? Ways in which that we can communicate. Now, if I was creating an education system, then I know that if a person can read well and they can write well, then their ability to think is much greatly improved, right? Because if you're able to really deeply consider problems and challenges and how they intersect and how that's going to hit reality when you start creating these things, then you're going to be able to think better. You're going to be smarter, you're going to be more intelligent. You're going to be more able to deal with what happens in the world because, as we know, not everything goes right all of the time. So your communication and your literacy, well, that's really important. Now, how would I create literate adults? Well, I would get them to read. I'd get them to read the classics. I'd get them to read all different kinds of books. I'd get them to read, the Greek epics. I'd get them to read. I'd get them to read all kinds of different literature. And I would spend a really good chunk of my time getting children to read. And I wouldn't basically get them to read anything that was anything later than, say, 1960. I'd really go back and go to the classics, the best books that we human beings have ever created. I get them to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, these classic books. That is what I'd get them to read. Because as we know, the more that we're able to read, the more we're able to understand these books, able to get a better connection to our own human intuition, and we're just going to be better human beings. We're able to think better so that we're going to be able to do more within society, okay? That's the first thing I would do. Okay. The second thing that I would do is that from a very early age, I would personalise the teaching. So what does that mean? It means that we're all born with different traits, right? Some people are artistic. Some people work with their hands, right? They're engineers. Some people are creative, so they're able to solve problems, solve challenges. Some people are a bit more analytical. They work with code. Right, they're good for that. Some people work with numbers. Some people are musical. So what I would do is that I would do my very best to find within a child all of these traits, right? Which one of these traits is the child most deeply connected to? And I would encourage that child to find their own path to go into one of these traits, right? We've all known people from school who, they're really sporty or they're really musical, and yeah, we can all learn these things, but some people have got a greater disposition than others. So if from an early age we're saying, hey, we're going to look at your traits and we're going to see how those traits helps you learn, and you're going to create children which aren't what? They're not going to be confused. So if you know from a very early age what you're good at, what you enjoy, what you're passionate about, then you're going to become an adult who knows exactly what they want to do. So they're going to be very purposeful. Okay? Now, I did my psychology dissertation on purpose, and I can tell you that in every single life dimension, if you have a clear purpose, you are better. You live longer, you're happier, people around you happy, you make more money. Having a clear purpose, knowing what you're good at, knowing what you do, knowing you have really great self-esteem. Because remember, if you're going to be encouraged to pursue what you love, you're going to have really high self-esteem. You're going to think really highly of yourself. And that creates a really great person to be around. So you're going to be having purposeful adults who are also illiterate and can communicate really well. The third thing that I would do is I would get children to love learning. So how do you get a child to love learning? You encourage them. Okay? You'd encourage them. If you're encouraging a child, you are constantly telling them how wonderful they are, how brilliant they are, how skilled they are. You never put a child down. Not ever. You're encouraging them to learn. Another thing to get a person to love learning is that when they do something right, you reward. Right? You reward. You constantly reward, you constantly affirm where a child is at. And the third and most important thing, you would reduce stress. The last thing a child needs is to be stressed. Because if a child is stressed, they're not going to grow properly, they're not going to develop properly. And how are they going to love learning if when they think of school, when they think of education, they think, oh, they get stressed. And as we know, stress stays in the body. So that's what I would do. I'd get them to love learning. The fourth thing, and this is the penultimate thing I'd do, is I'd get them real-world experience. So what does real-world experience mean? It means that I would encourage these children to start businesses. I'd get them to interact with the news, with politics. I would get them to write about the news, about politics, and what we think is going to happen next. I'd get them to actively engage with what they're seeing. I would get them to start businesses. A 14 or 15-year-old, they can make coffee. Right? They can make coffee. They can make cakes. Maybe 4 or 5 times a year, you'd have a bake sale. And you'd get them to go through the entire process of doing it, right? What's the marketing materials like? How are you going to sell it? Where are you going to price it? Right? How are you going to make profit from doing this? Who are you going to sell it to? I would get them to do this really, really, really regularly. I would get them to read the news and understand the news regularly. I'd get them to go, okay, so this is what you're looking at. This is the news. What aren't they saying? And what are they saying? Right? What is it? I'd get them to see through what is happening so that I can get a really clear idea of what's real and what's not. Because if you have real-world experience, then you are ready. You are prepared for life. And the last thing that I would do is I'd help them with creative thinking or problem solving. Let's face it. The world is changing every 3, 5, 7 years. And that's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Which means the problems and challenges that we would face today we wouldn't particularly face them 10 years ago. Or the way in which we solve these challenges has changed. So we need someone who's got really great creative thinking, really great problem-solving abilities, so that you can keep up. And not only that, you need to love to learn as well. Because if you're loving to learn, then you're going to be keeping up with the world and how it's changing. So this is how I would restructure the education system. This is how I would create the best education system. There we go. That is how I would create the best education system. Now, I want you to ask yourself the question, are you a fully literate, ready to put all these books, a purposeful, prepared for life when you left school, a love of learning, and are you a creative problem solver? Were you that as soon as you left school? Yes or no? If you are the vast majority, the answer is a big, fat no. No. You weren't. You weren't. You weren't this. So the question is, why isn't schooling, regular schooling, like this? So what does actual schooling create? Well, you're not reading the classics. You're not reading all these classic books. So what does that create? It means that your mind, right, your brain, well, it's not actually retaining the information. Not really. Because what are you taught? You're taught to read a book. Okay? You're taught to read a book. You have a little test. And the knowledge of this book, it just leaves the brain completely, doesn't it? Because you don't need this anymore. So you're not learning to love the book. You're not loving and enjoying it. You don't care. And it means that if you can't communicate well, then you can't think well. Right? If you can't communicate well, it means you can't think well. So what are we creating? What is going to be creating? We're creating people who are less able to communicate, less able to think, less able to put their thoughts and feelings and opinions to other people. So we're getting more and more and more illiterate. This is getting worse. If you ever meet like a 13, 14-year-old, it's worse, right? And my generation is, Zoomer generation, and I'm an early Zoomer. I was 98. I was born in 98. This is getting worse. This is seriously getting worse as we go. So by the time that I've had children, it's if the school system allows this to carry on, it's going to be hellish. Really, really, really hellish. I also mentioned about purpose, right? If you know exactly what you need to do from an early age, you aren't going to be what? You aren't going to be confused. Now, what is it like if you meet someone who knows exactly what they're doing? Right, they are laser beam focused, right? Laser beam focused on what it is that they want. And if you're laser beam focused on what it is that you want, you have purpose. Which is what I mentioned earlier, right? And if you have purpose, all of your health and all the things in your life improves. So why is it that we want people to be confused? Why is it the system is creating quite confused people who leave school and they go, I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what how I want to contribute to society in my particular way. I don't really understand what I want to do. The school system's failed if you haven't prepared a child for adulthood. And knowing what that child wants to do initially, obviously things change. Well, that's a clear failure in our education system. Okay. What did I say the third thing was? The third thing was love. The third thing I said was love to learn. How many of you watching this have a love to learn? And how many of you had a love to learn straight after school? I didn't. I didn't have a love to learn straight after school. I was happy when it ended. I didn't want to learn anymore. I was done. I've had to learn to love to learn in my adulthood. because I know the more I learn, the more money that I would make. Now it's different. Now I know that the more I learn, the closer I get to God or the divine. Right, so my motivations are different, but I've had to love to learn. Well, if you love to learn, what are you doing? You're constantly bringing in new information, new data. That's information. Right. New data. It's data. Into your mind. And then what are you spotting? You're spotting patterns. Now, if a person is constantly spotting patterns, you're quite a dangerous person. Because it means that you can see ahead. You can see ahead. You can see, well, if this and this and this take place, if this lines up in this particular way, which I think it is, then I'm going to do this. And I'm going to say this to my family. And I'm going to tell them, when this happens, you need to react in this particular way. And this will happen. So what is one of these people like? Well, they would constantly upset what? The status quo. They would be constantly upsetting the status quo. And they would then interact negatively with elites. Now, they would then... Because if you're upsetting the status quo because you understand and you can see, well, the elites create the narrative already. So this is why children are encouraged not to love learning. And last, but by no means least, creativity and problem solving. Why is it that schools don't give us real world experience? Why is it? They don't give us real world experience because they want us to be fundamentally unprepared for real life. Because if you knew precisely how the game was played, well, what would you do? You would reject the system. That's what you would do. You'd reject the system. Because if you're a child and you're going, hold on a minute, I'm gonna end school, I'm gonna finish schooling, and then I'm gonna go into a 9 to 5 where, and this is for Gen Alpha, by the way, or Gen Z. I'm gonna go to 9 to 5 where I'm going to have to pay a shitload of taxes. I'm then going to have to work my arse off for not being able to afford a mortgage on a house or get a house. I'm going to struggle to get myself a girlfriend because there's fewer and fewer and fewer of us. Why would I want to be part of this system? You wouldn't. You'd reject it. And then you would immediately try and create your own system. Right? And you'd get together and say, well, I don't want to be part of this system. Let's all come together and let's create our own system. So if you're able to think creatively and solve problems, well, then guess what you're doing? You're upsetting the balance. You're upsetting the balance of the existing power dynamics. And that's problematic. That's problematic. So, this is why school sucks. Because if you were to actually create a really great education system, which producing children with all these different qualities, what are they going to do? They are going to, number one, create their own systems. Right? That's the first thing they're going to do. And if you're able to create your own systems, you're able to take chaos and turn it into order. That's what a system is. You take chaos and you turn it into order. Now, if you're able to take chaos and turn it into order, what does that mean? It means you get a lot of money. Right? People that are creative make a shitload of cash. Lots and lots and lots of money. The more creative you are, you want to channel that into a way which benefits society. Supposedly, you make lots of money. Now, this isn't a problem if you have a poor country. Because if you have a poor country, then you want your students to make lots of money. You want adults to make loads of money so that you can improve your country. China did this. If you look at the past emerging economies, especially Eastern emerging economies, this is what they did. This is how they created really great education systems. Finland as well. Finland's doing this. Israel's doing this as well. That's another country which is currently emerging and growing. Right? This is what they would do. Because there is no current power and financial systems that could be affected. So you want these things to take place. Right? So existing power structures aren't going to want you to do this. Another thing, if you are creating your own systems, then what are you creating? You're creating a level of community. Okay? You're creating a level of community, which means that your family, so this is your family, okay? Your family, well, you care about other families. And they care about other families too. And you all want to win. And all of you want to get together and help this new system, help your country, help your society, help everything else, right? You get together. What is school like instead? It's not like this, is it? It's not like that. It's not communal. It is competitive. That's what school is like. It's competitive. Another thing I mentioned is that if you try to get someone to love learning, you wouldn't put pressure on them. Because pressure really screws with you. Why put pressure on? So instead what you do is you have tests. What do tests do? Pressure, stress, anxiety. And as we know, just a reminder, what does anxiety do? It absolutely screws with the brain. And of course, if you're not thinking right, you're not going to be creative, blah, blah, blah. I've gone into it a couple of times before. So you get this, you understand this. So you can see that how our education system is created, we're not creating literate, purposeful, creative individuals that love learning, that are in a community. We're not creating that. We're creating anxious, competitive, low creativity, low literacy, low purposeful individuals, which can be what? These people, what? If you're creating someone like this, it's easy to do what? It's easy to control. It's easy to control them, because of course it is. So if you ask the question, why didn't we learn all this at school? Well, why would they teach you this at school? Why would existing power structures teach you anything of how the world really functions, of how the world really works? Why would they do that? So why would institutional power, the elites, want you to have a great education? Well, they wouldn't. In fact, education is designed, this is by design, to do 5 things. The first thing it's designed to do is suppress critical thinking. If you're able to critically think, then you're able to see through their lies, their deception. You're able to understand when something isn't quite right. You're able to take a step back emotionally from getting, captured into a whirlwind of emotion and go, whoa. How does that make sense with this? How does that make sense with it? You're able to see that. The second thing it does is it creates a national identity. We as human beings, for the longest time, have got really no concept of a nation state, identity, of a national identity. Because, we were in tribes for the longest time. And if you're tribe, look, if you say an Englishman, say in Cornwall, I've really got no serious connection to that person in Cornwall. But as soon as you say he's an Englishman, I'm an Englishman, so I can associate myself with that identity. And if you have a shared identity, And the people that are in charge, right, the elite, and the people that are in charge, right, the elites, well, they can use that identity to control us. The third thing it does is that it enforces ideological loyalty. Okay? That's the third thing it does. If you're learning all the time at school how things are, how things meant to be, then what is happening is that you are being suppressed. Your creativity is being suppressed. So that you should be loyal to the state, loyal to the government, loyal to all these things. Because you've been told that from when you were like 3 or 4 years old. Okay? Now the fourth thing it's able to do, enable hierarchies. You should know who is better than you. You should know who shouldn't challenge. You should know these things. That's what school does. And the last thing, last but by no means least, is it creates obedient slaves. It creates obedient slaves. If you sit here and say, well, I'm not a slave, right, and you have a 9 to 5, and you work your arse off and you pay tax and you do all these things, I'm sorry, you are. You want to try and escape? Great. This is the start. Realising these things. But you have been trained and educated and brainwashed. You've been brainwashed into believing these things. You've been brainwashed by this system. Education is brainwashing. That's what education is. There's no other way around it. That is what education is. That is the purpose of education, to brainwash you into believing these things, which frankly are only there to serve a pre-existing elite class. That is the purpose of education. If you don't believe me, that's fine. Absolutely fine. We'll go into the PowerPoint and I'm going to show you some historical examples of where this has worked, where this has took place. And hopefully it'll help you to open your eyes and see what has been going on. So as I was mentioning before, here are the 5 pillars of educational control: critical thinking, suppression, national identity, ideological loyalty, social hierarchies, and obedience. Before state-mandated education, students apprenticed to masters for years, learning both practically and theoretically. Consider, who would you trust more? Someone who spent 10 years getting educated about health in classrooms, or someone who spent 10 years working in hospitals, moving through actual roles? This is a really big thing, right? How do you get all of those things? How do you get creativity? How do you get literacy and be able to communicate? How do you get all these things? You get it from learning from people who have actually done it. The best system is, of course, an apprentice system. Because as soon as you find what your traits are, well, you should be put with somebody who is a master of those traits, a master of those skills, so that you can learn from them. That's the best way for you to learn. It's how I've personally learned. When I learned sales, I learned it from someone called James, and he was 40 years into his career by that point. And I learned everything that I know from him. He gave me a ginormous leap in my understanding of sales, psychology, and business, because he'd been through a lot of difficult challenges, right? So I'm going to go and approach a master if I want to learn something. And you should too. rather than trying to get yourself educated in a school system. So, the apprenticeship model threatened elite control because it created competent, independent thinkers with direct connections to production. State education solved this problem by standardising mediocrity whilst embedding obedience. So if I ask you, okay, what is learning? What is learning? Well, if you are indoctrinated into the system, you would say that you read a book, right, or the teacher reads from a book and they write on like a blackboard, right? And then what you do, you take a test. And then you get graded by this test. And that is what most people would say learning is. Learning is this. Well, learning isn't this, is it really? That's not what learning is. This is a system for control and obedience. Because what is a grade? What is a grade? That's what you get from a tester, isn't it? A grade equals to your level of obedience. That's what a grade is. How obedient are you? How much have you sat there and studied? How much have you been a good boy or a good girl and obeyed? That's what a grade is. How much have you obeyed the existing power structure? How much have you done that? And the higher your grades, the more obedient that you were, the more that you submitted to existing power structures. That's what it is. If you were really learning, it's not about your grades. Your grades don't matter. Tests, they don't matter either. What would matter is your ability to do what? Your ability to perform. That's what would matter. Your ability to do, act, think, your ability to solve in the world. That's what would matter. And you'd be rewarded based on these things. And guess what? Society, if you own a business, I've owned a few different businesses, right? If you have a business, that is what society rewards you for. It does reward you for those things. But education system doesn't reward you for those things. It rewards you instead for your obedience and your ability to go along with the system, to not think, to not question. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. By prioritising uniformity, education enables power systems such as military service, economic productivity, social stability, because students internalise rules as innate rather than constructed. This reduces the need for external enforcement, creating self-perpetuating compliance cycles where educated individuals become system agents themselves. And historically, this has been through mandatory routines, punishments and isolation from alternative influences. So the Spartans did this, quite often. Spartans did this quite often. So this is the Sumerian Ebduba, right? Creating bureaucratic obedience. To provide context, education systems in ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer was highly advanced civilization located in southern Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq, flourishing from 4500 to 1900 BCE. Had a sophisticated writing system known as cuneiform, was characterised by wedge-shaped marks impressed on clay tablets. The primary education institutions in Sumer were called Eduba, a Sumerian term literally meaning tablet house, where scribes were trained. And they had to go through rote memorisation, physical punishment, moral conditioning, etc. So again, this is what's happening. I'm not going to read this out to you. I'm sure many people have said to me by now, because I'm doing all these in like over a couple of days, and I'm releasing them in like over the course of months. I don't need to read. I'll just put up the text, and you guys can just read it. Okay. So this is education for specialised roles. So the Indian system, right? The Indian system, this is what they have in India, right? They have Shudras, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmins. Right, they're trained as priests and scholars focused on Vedic knowledge and ritual practices. That's what these guys do. Again, this is a system. This is a system for control. 100%. Look up the Indian caste system. This still exists right now. This still exists. This system still exists. Right, medieval guilds. Medieval guilds were instrumental in establishing structural systems for vocational education, ensuring the creation of highly skilled craftsmen and the maintenance of rigorous quality standards through apprenticeships to be lasting 7 to 10 years. So this is the alternative, okay? This is the alternative. You'd go on an apprenticeship. So let's talk a little bit about Sparta. Now, Sparta was one of the first systems that did this, and this is how they did it, okay? Number one, they would remove a child from the family. So if you imagine that you were a little child, right? So, you're only, say, 7, right? And you've got a mom, and you've got a dad, and these people, I think that's the mom. I put some trousers on the dad. There we go. Gotta love those gender stereotypes. There we go. So there we go. There's the mom. There's the dad. What is the worst thing that can happen to you as a mother? Right? It's obviously that your child is taken away from you. That's the worst thing that can happen to a parent, is your child taken away from you. Well, what happens? Well, for 6 hours of the day, so for half the day, that is what happens in modern education. You're taken away from your mum. You're then placed into a classroom with other children where you don't know where your mother and father are. So what happens, right? It creates anxiety, stress. And if you're anxious and if you're stressed, you're willing then to take orders. Because the people that you rely on for everything, well, they're not there anymore. So you must therefore place your faith in who? You place your faith in the teacher. Now the teacher, whether they know it or not, if you're a teacher, nothing negative on you. But if you're a teacher, your whole job is to take what the existing power structure tells you to do and to deliver it. That is the job of the teacher. That is all the job of the teacher. Now, I don't blame the teacher for doing this. I don't blame the teacher for not going and thinking about these different things that I'm talking about. I don't blame the teacher at all. Because the teacher, they just want to get on. They've got bills to pay, right? They want to make money. They've got a family themselves. Like they don't want to rock the boat. If they rock the boat, then what's going to happen? Well, they're not going to be able to pay the bills. They're going to be able to make money, and their family's going to be a bit screwed, aren't they? So it's in the teacher's best interests to what? To support the system. So I don't blame the teacher at all, right? Most teachers never left school. Most teachers never even left school. This is their entire lives. Their entire life is school. Their entire life is within this system. So how could they possibly see outside of that system when something seriously goes wrong for them? So this is what happened in Sparta, right? Boys taken from their mothers, placed in barracks to break family bonds and create state loyalty. They said they faced deliberate hardship, scant rations, exposed to elements, ritual punishments, built resilience while teaching absolute submission. Had peer enforcement, so they had age-based groups, or agalia, right, where collective shaming enforced norms, students policed each other. So the students became the moral teachers of the system itself. There were secret hunts of helots. Helots were slaves. Taught conformity to Spartan values through violence against the enslaved. So in Sparta, it was a slave-based system, right? So lots of slaves, and there was more slaves than what there were Spartans. Right? There's probably like 4 times as many slaves than what there were Spartans. So what does this mean? It means that you need a system where the Spartans, saw the slaves as, less than nothing, right? So you needed to create a system which did that. So do you see how this is why I can state with conviction that the education system is there to brainwash you, because I can see from what is required from this system, and I can work backwards to understand what is going to be created to support this system. So I can go, okay, well, our system is supported by suppression of critical thinking, to create a nation state, to enforce agricultural loyalty, to enable hierarchies, to create obedient slaves. That is what our system needs to function so that existing power structures are maintained. Because that's what education systems have done in the past for exactly the same things. Right? And I'm showing you these examples now. So, as you can see, that's what these load. This is Athens, the favour, democratic obedience. I'll let you guys read that in your own time. Now this, I want to talk about nation state or national identity. Okay, so the nation state is 100% a modern invention. How did things work for the vast majority of time? Well, what happened is you've got little tribes or villages, and maybe you've got the odd town, or maybe you've got one or two big cities. And you would be, let's say, John of London, or you'd be Philip of Chester. Right, Philip Chester. And you'd give a name based on where you were, or you give a name based on your occupation. So my last name is Smith. So guess what? Someone at some point had my occupation as a last name, right? Now, even last names only came into effect during the Black Death, the plague in Europe. You wouldn't even have a last name until people started to move around these places, right? Because you just have one Philip, it's Big Philip, or Little Philip, or Philip by the pub. That is how you were known. So it wasn't until you had to start moving around for work, which is what happened with the Black Death, you even had a last name. So as you can see, all these different things, you were just known for in your local area. That there was no big homogeneous connecting piece for all of these different people. That is why the nation state had to be invented, so that there was this big connecting piece. And if you're able to bring everyone together, then it's a much easier force of people to control. Before modern nation states, cultural and political identities were fluid and tied to localities, kinship, religion, or empires, rather than fixed territorial nations, right? So where I live, there used to be quite a fierce rivalry from two villages. And they were right next to each other. That's what it was like. You'd have rival villages, rival tribes, rather than rival countries. That is an invention of the last few hundred years, really. Especially look at Germany as well. Germany was feudal states for a very, very, very long time. Up until the last 200 years, it's been that way in Germany. So here's some examples. Prussia. Following Napoleonic defeats, compulsory schooling forged German identity from fragmented principalities, enforcing language and military drills. Revolutionary France. Public schools instilled La Nation through republican curricula, replacing regional identities with French citizenship. Meiji Japan. Imperial rescript on education mandated emperor worship, replacing feudal domain identities with a unified Japanese self. And America. Horseman's compulsory education Americanized immigrants, replacing ethnic identities with a national melting pot myth. And then we have suppressing critical thinking, okay? The big example here was Egyptian scribal schools, Chinese Confucian academies, medieval monastic education. All of these things reduced critical thinking. Now, Egyptian scribal schools was dogma as divine truth. So what they would do is that you would have to sit in these in these temples, and you are forced to just write out by rote, basically, the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You weren't allowed to question. You weren't allowed to wonder why. Just ritualistic copying. That's what it says here. Your Confucian Academies, the eight-legged essay. So these were tests, right? These were 700 years worth of tests, right, in China. So you'd go through these really long essays, really long tests, and you'd have to go through them in order to go and work within the government as a part of the bureaucracy in order to upkeep the system. And the medieval monastic education, exactly the same, right? It was scriptural. You had to learn the scripture. There's no other way of going about it. So this is education's ultimate function. Okay. Education's ultimate function is obedience, submission to hierarchy. You've got to know where the hierarchy is. Class reproduction masters meritocracy. So the education system, isn't about you becoming a better individual. It's not about that at all. It's about merit. It's not about meritocracy. It's about mediocrity. Because if you're mediocre, then you can't challenge the elite class. You can't challenge them, and you can't challenge their children. That is why the vast majority of people are kept exactly where they are via the education system. If you stay mediocre, then how are you going to be able to challenge the elites and their children? You can't. Not really. Right? And of course, bring money into this as well. If you're constantly stressing about money and all these other different things, you're not going to be able to think about these things fully, right? Loyalty. Emotional attachment to abstract entities like national ideology, identity, personal self, subsumed into collective categories, and conformity. Critical thinking is suppressed in favour of received, supposed wisdom. Now, I've mentioned this before. This is the alternative, an apprenticeship model. This is actually the best way to learn, is an apprenticeship model, easily, right? So this is why, in the modern day, we're seeing a crackdown on who? We're seeing a crackdown on farmers, small business owners, because what do farmers, small business owners do? They're outside of the system, right? The money that they get is outside of traditional hierarchies. So what they can do, if they're outside of this system, well, they've got time to do what? They've got time to think, like what I've done. They've got time to consider and think critically about what's going on. They've got time to do these things, which is why we're seeing now in modern day that farmers are enemy number one, because they're truly independent. We're going to start seeing a crackdown on small businesses. It's not going to be like farmers. It's going to be like an increase in the way in which they do tax, right? It's going to be higher complexity. Because the higher the complexity that something is, the harder it is for small business owners to stay afloat. So they'll be forced to get, a job. Because existing power structures wants you to have a job. Because if you have a job, you're not thinking. You're too busy to really think about these things. So anything which is a decentralized from the network is seen as, bad. It's going to be punished. Okay? So that is pretty much my conversation today about why education sucks. It sucks because it's all about control. That's why it sucks. They're not here to help you become a better person. They're here for you to become a slave that they're able to extract monetary value from. Now here's the question for you. The elite class, what do the elites learn? They don't learn anything that you learn. Not really. They learn those different things. They learn about literacy. They learn about purpose. They learn about critical thinking. They learn about how to communicate well. They learn these things. Because they, the elite class, well, they want to perpetuate their lineage and they want to pass down their power. And the only way they can pass down their power is if they have children. And these children all go to the same schools. You know, Eton, Oxford, Cambridge. They all go to the same schools. If you're American, is that the same thing? Because these people will stay together, help each other out, and these people become your leaders, the elite. That's how the system works. You were never meant to get a good education. It is not designed for you, mere mortal, to get an education, a good education. It was designed for these people to have what? To have an unfair advantage over you. So they can rule you. So these people don't have this critical thinking suppressed. They don't believe in a nation state. What do they believe in? They're globalists. What are these taught? They're taught the only thing that matters is themselves. The only thing that matters is power. That's the only thing that matters. That's what these people are taught at school, in their education. You're not taught that. You're taught to put the nation state over everything else. You're taught to work hard. These people are taught to exploit. That's what these people are taught. And this is why education sucks for the majority. Because it's not designed to help you, it's designed to enslave you, it's designed to brainwash you. And it's been that way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Okay, folks, that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the 4th instalment. And remember, if you want to watch them all in one go, come to my school page. These are completely free. They'll all be there. And you'll be able to get the PowerPoint and read it at your own time as well. Okay, folks, take care. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.